Resuming debate, the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's a great honour to rise in this House to represent the people of Timmins James Bay. But I have to say, it isn't an honour to participate night after night, day after day, in the Potemkin democracy of what we become. The farce that we are in this House, and it needs to be said, where we all stand up and call each other the honourable member this and the honourable member that. And what we learned is that it's very unparliamentary. I cannot say that anybody lies, Mr. Speaker. You'd be very outraged. But it's perfectly acceptable to lie in the House, and we just have to say, well, that was government opinion, it was how it was stated, but we cannot call that out. And that's somehow considered parliamentary because we're based on a gentleman's code here. Of course, that's an old-fashioned sexist term, but we don't actually have rules except for the rules that are in place for the officers of Parliament, whose job it is to hold us to account. And yet we see with this government, this concerted attack on the credibility of the officers of Parliament. And they'll stand up in this House and tell us how they all care about access to information. It's a farce, Mr. Speaker. Canada was a world leader in access to information. Year after year under this government, we fall further and further behind. Guess where we're at now? We're about number 56. So that puts Honduras, that puts Russia ahead of us. And they stand up there and talk about fighting for democracy. When you have corrupt countries like Honduras and Nigeria and Russia serving their citizens with access to information requests better than this government, you know where we stand. So then what we get the Treasury Board president, who's like a flim-flam artist at a country fair, who's saying, I'm going to give you the big prize. Put your money down. The big prize is a booby prize. It's data sets. It's open government. What was the great line I heard? It was machine-readable formats. My God, what the heck is a machine-readable format? You know what that is, Mr. Speaker? It's junk. What they do is give people junk. Meanwhile, they suppress the evidence that counts. The information that people need, Mr. Speaker, are about who made the decisions, why the decision was made, and who was in the room when the decision was made. But we know within the Minister's offices, those are black holes of accountability. The Information Commissioner has spoken out in that time and time again. But it's not just that they have a black hole of accountability. They've set out to fully monkey wrench the Information Commissioner, just like the ridiculous member for York Centre and his witch hunt against parliamentary officers for their supposed partisan activities. So what we have now is the Information Commissioner writing to the Treasury Board president, the man that I said earlier was like a flim-flam artist at the country fair, and she's saying that without the proper funding, she is not going to be able to fulfill her mandate. That's what the Information Commissioner is telling us, that there is a fundamental problem. And the reason she doesn't have the funding to do her job is because she doesn't have the order-making powers, Mr. Speaker. If she had the order-making powers, she wouldn't have to go to court all the time. So I see my Conservative friends stand up and say, oh my God, order-making powers, that's a very, very bad thing. It's so bad it was the #1 promise in the Conservative election commitment in 2006 when it came to accountability. They said they would give the Information Commissioner the power to release the order of information. And they lied to the Canadian people. They stood up on the issue of access to information and they promised that they would reform the system. Instead, they sit there and they guffaw on the backbenches, happily carrying on this farce that we are somehow an accountable democracy, when the Access to Information officer is telling us that the system is broken, Mr. Speaker. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means, Mr. Speaker, that the fundamental principle of an accountable democracy is maximum privacy for citizens and maximum accountability and transparency for government. These guys flip it upside down. They want maximum transparency for their political enemies. So when you see them talk about accountability and access to information, you'll never see them talk about their corrupt lobbyist insiders and their friends. Oh no, it's their big trio, the big bad trio, the corrupt Indian chiefs. We heard that tonight. Oh, we're going after those First Nations. The big bad union bosses. #2, let's go after them. #3, the radical environmentalists. That they use the Canada Revenue Agency now in a total corruption of government operations to go after bird watchers because they threaten the interests of the tar sands. Meanwhile, their pals are getting away with whatever they want. So what we've seen here in their idea of accountability is accountability towards their political enemies. That's what they do. They use the levers of government, misrepresent the use of Parliament. They undermine the officers of Parliament. They go after people who are environmentalists. They go after First Nation people. They use them as the big boogeyman, the bad chiefs. They go after people in organized labor. Meanwhile, the issue that we're dealing with here is the fact that they're suppressing information. There's been political interference. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? You'll die of old age before you ever get any documents out of this government, because they just keep putting it off and off and off. Well, they think it's all funny, Mr. Speaker. They think it's funny till they're defeated by the Canadian people, because it's a fundamental issue of arrogance and laziness that we see here. Access to information should not be a partisan issue. Access to information is about accountability to the Canadian people. And they say, time and time again, the Canadian people be damned. This is about protecting themselves, protecting their ministers. So I'll give you an example. When they lost the financial information on 500,000 Canadians, did they give a darn about the Canadians' financial information? No, they were worried about an incompetent minister, so they suppressed the information. They sat on it. Now, the first thing you learn, Mr. Speaker, when data has been compromised is you have to alert people, because they could be subject to cyber fraud. Oh, we hear them talk about cyber fraud all the time. But no, they did not tell anybody, because they were more concerned about protecting an incompetent minister. What we have, along with this faux democracy, is we have faux ministers. They're bobbleheads. None of them take responsibility for what's happening in their offices. They're protecting the decisions that are being made, that are being given to them in orders, and they're suppressing this information. So when we have, Mr. Speaker, the Information Commissioner, a person who has enormous respect in this country, having to write to the Treasury Board President, the man who spent $50 million in border infrastructure money on pork barrel projects in his riding, and said he had no documentation. Oh my God, I lost the documents. That's the man who's supposed to represent access to information. So he'll talk about open government, and he'll talk about data sets, and he'll talk about, what was it, machine-readable formats. This man took $50 million from border infrastructure and blew it in his riding and said that he didn't have a single document. But that wasn't true, Mr. Speaker. The documents did exist. Under access to information, they blocked the ability of the public to see those documents, but we got those documents through the provincial, through municipalities, and we found out that, you know what, this minister came up with his own homemade forms. This was like the Muskoka minister. Just fill it out, and you know what, you might get a free set of Muskoka steak knives at the end of it, and if not, at least we'll raise a sunken boat. You'll get a lighthouse. You know, we'll build you a lake in a place where there's 1,000 lakes. And you know what? It used to be the day, Mr. Speaker, people who were that incompetent got fired. Oh no, my God! Not under the Conservatives. You get promoted if you can take that much money. If you can stand up and tell Canadians you lost the paper, even though the papers existed everywhere in all those little municipalities, if you can get away with that, what does the Prime Minister think? He thinks, this is the man that I'm going to put in charge of ensuring that all the other departments follow their paperwork. That's the man they picked. The Muskoka ShamWow salesman. Do you remember that? The guy did a television commercial selling cleaning products in China. This is their idea of how government's done. So, Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about access to information, and we see that Canada was a world leader, and that we see that our parliamentary budget officers are the most respected people that we have in this country, and they attack them, and they ridicule them, and they sit and make farting jokes and laughing because they think it's funny. Well, it's not funny, Mr. Speaker. This is about the lifeblood of democracy. So they can sit over there in their fake democracy and insult people, but the fact is they've undermined the systems of accountability that hold them accountable, because it's their corruption, Mr. Speaker, the Canadians are fed up with. Thank you very much.